Welcome to the First Funders Podcast. Today we have Arian Ghashghai, the founder and GP of Earthling VC. And before we get into the podcast, I wanted to tee up something new we have this week. We have a guest co-host coming in, a friend of mine, Dan Hightower, and I'd love for Dan to introduce himself.
Sure, happy to. I'm Dan. I built product at AngelList. Before that, I started a couple companies, sold one of them, and started angel investing after that first one. So happy to be here.
So with that, what's really fun about this podcast is all three of us know each other from something similar. In 2020, 2021, a friend of mine who was running a very active syndicate on AngelList was looking to get help and invited me to join a crew of people. And Dan was already on this founding crew of something called DVC. And over the years of doing that, Arian joined. And so I know that I haven't had the chance to do an investment with Arian, but I have with Dan. But it's kind of fun to have people together who've been on group calls together looking at deals. So that's a bit about how Arian and I know. And the time that I met you, you were thinking about your next steps. You were at Meta investing on the side. And I went off and had a baby, and then I came back, and you're like, dude, I have a fund. And we've kept in touch, and I absolutely love what you're doing. Really taking that brave feat to just say, hey, I'm going to launch a fund, like in the most interesting of times, both economically and from a technology standpoint. And so with that, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and maybe talk about how you also got into investing.
Yeah, so just sort of taking off the top, and then I think kind of working back from the front briefly. And I think I'll just try to do it fast so we can just double click on whatever's interesting. But so currently now, small solo GP pre-seed fund investing. I describe it as a bunch of things. I mean, I generally call it like the next paradigm of digital tech, but like concretely, we're like focusing on VR, AI, and robotics, and all those things intersect because my belief bottoms up from Charles, as you mentioned earlier. I worked at Oculus before as an AI engineer, kind of had built a very bottoms-up thesis of that's kind of the backbone of the future of computing, and so that's for investing now, and it's been a lot of fun. So in terms of like how I got there, so for me, I think the origin is I dropped out of college and started a company, and so did that for 2 years. Company failed, went back. Of course, through being a founder, you get exposed a little bit to the whole VC world and that side of the table, how things work. And I think one of the takeaways I had from my post-mortem on that company failing was like, I hate being a founder, actually, but I like startups. Like I like the missionary aspect. You can influence the world. And from learning what investors do, I felt like they do what I think I'm better at. Because one of the failings I think I had with the company was I sucked at being very vertical. Like I was always like, what's the new framework? What's going on, right? Like really looking at things at a very high level. And so I always felt like maybe I want to try this investor thing because I think that's a lot of what they do is kind of looking at markets more broadly and things that are going on and making bets within that, kind of going in and out again, right? I just felt that was more like my style. So fast forward, I ended up at Facebook. You get disposable income all of a sudden to just YOLO at startups, right? So started doing it right there because I always kind of knew I wanted to do it. And, so I did a couple of deals at the beginning, like, let me see if I actually like this, like if my thesis is right. And I freaking ended up loving it. And like first couple of businesses that I invested in, like spent a lot of time, was like very involved, and can obviously dive into those because I think it might be unexpected given what I've talked about so far and like what I'm obviously doing today with the fund and all of that, my professional background. But yeah, just loved it and just decided, wanted to do it a little bit more seriously. And then a sequence of things happened to running syndicates, joining DVC, like you mentioned, and then ultimately feeling like I kind of have to do a fund to kind of keep going. And so it was more just like a natural progression of, I like doing this and I just want to keep doing it. And it's just like you constantly have to like up the game, right? And kind of end up here.
How did you're like, I just started investing. Sounds like easy, right? But like, were you writing personal checks? How big were they? How were you sourcing your deals? I mean, you were at Meta.
Yeah.
First of all, love the thinking, right? Hey, I'm at Meta. I have disposable income. Let me see if this is even what I want to do. And I had the same thinking. And I think some of us have sort of thought, hey, on the side, let me test this out. But in reality, when I talk to very fresh folks who haven't written their first check, they don't know where to start. So just for the audience, tell us how you actually got started.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of serendipity, right? I think is the way it was for me, right? Because I knew, like, to be honest, I think until I wrote the first check, my general idea was, okay, I have to build a company at some point, sell it for $500 million. And then, you do Shark Tank, right? Like, was kind of a bit of like what my idea was, right, at the time. But so the way it came about was, I mean, to make a very long story short, like I went to college at Georgetown. And so a lot of my college friends and stuff went into investment banking and private equity and that sort of thing. And one of my friends he's ironically like a VC at NEA now, but he was just in PE at the time. Or I think he was actually still banking actually at the time. Like he was definitely not in VC in any case. Had a friend that was doing basically private equity investment at Blackstone, I want to say, in CPG companies. And so part of this guy's job, of course, was to go source all kinds of different companies. And there's one company he found that was totally from Blackstone that he put personal money in because he kind of knew the founder somehow. I don't remember the exact backstory. And so anyway, that went to my friend, and then my friend came to me, right? And was also like, hey, I know you're into the startup stuff because we talked about it, like, want to do this, right? It was basically this like CPG company. They're doing like better for you gummies. They're doing really well, actually. Like, it's like probably one of my best investments to date. It's like, and I was literally, my thought process was, I don't know anything about CPG. I don't know anything about this industry. And we were like the first check. This was like, he was trying to raise, I think, $100,000 on like $1 million post or something, right? It was like some really early deal. And so like, we were like 20% of that round. Like me and my friend both ended up putting 10K in. And again, I had no idea. The only thing that I was like, I tried to be analytical, but at the end I was like, this guy like made like a CPG company in Canada before. It was really successful, right? But he got screwed over somehow. So, but basically he knew how to do it. He was just like, I just need the money and I know how to do it. And I got really convinced that I'm like, this guy's just a legend. Like, I have no idea what the hell he's doing, but I just think he's going to figure it out. And I would say to date, like, still early in all of this, is we're any good at this or not, right? But like, definitely one of my lower concern investments. It also happens to be my first one, and probably the one I did with the most like primitive thought process ever. And I think that's a trend that I think I will come back to. Like, I'm teeing this up for a point I probably want to make throughout this podcast, that really it just like find legendary people, just give them money, basically, right? Is really like, you don't have to overcomplicate it. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the origin story. And then I went into that investment, and I was like the AI guy. So there are a few other investors in that company that were, of course, doing more private investing as well. And so they were like, oh, let's just send you like stuff that we see. And so I started getting some deals from some co-investors of that company. And basically that's how it started to kind of spiral. But I think like in hindsight, the point I would caution there is I definitely like spent a lot of time on that company when I invested, because it was my first one. It was the only thing. And I was like, I don't know if this is going to come again, right? And for me, it was fun, right? So I was like, I got pretty involved. Like, this was during COVID even, like there was some CPG conference or something. The founder is Canadian, so the US didn't let him in. And like, I ended up going with another investor to like represent the company at like this thing and like pitching the company like at this like expo and stuff, right? So I got like pretty involved. And I think that was actually like foundationally at the beginning, which helped start the flywheel of like people sending me deals and having a reputation with founders. Because I think it's a referral business in the end of the day, right? And like, that I think is an important thing to note when you start, that like, doesn't really matter what you were doing before, but like, you have to kind of build your reputation as an investor. And part of doing that is just like generally being like, first of all, not being an asshole. I think it puts you in the top 10%, but then really being prepared to do the work, even as an investor, I think like kind of gets you further and starts a flywheel.
I love that. I love that a CPG deal kind of opened you up to AI deals.
Yeah.
Like, what an interesting bridge. I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah, because to be honest, when I started doing it, right, like I have a very clear thesis now. And like, fortunately that started to, because I think at some point to sort of jump a little bit forward, right, I started seeing more and more deals, right? I was like, I do want to shape my investing around the things where I know I'm very like good at, and it's also intellectually interesting to me because it's things that I do and where my professional background is. And so I feel like that's something I like started tailoring once I started putting a lot of reps in on just a lot of like random assortment of deals, right? Where I was like, okay, I know where I want to spend my time and where I'm going to be good. And I think what the intuition of that was, like, I have a lot better idea of now than at the time, right? Because at the time I was like, oh, like I work in VR, I should invest in VR companies, right? Like, I think now if you look at it from the perspective, like how to win at doing this, like I think the memes might be true, but like the ends of what you're actually trying to achieve is different. If it sounds a bit nebulous. So basically the way I would put it is the thing that I've realized through doing this, and like this is also like true with the CPG company. Like, I think one reason that's actually worked out well for me is because I happened to coincidentally stumble upon a guy that's just like probably top 1% talent in that industry, right? Like I don't know how many people you could have backed at the time that had this much experience and this much chip on their shoulder at the same time to start a business in that space, right? So I got lucky with that. But I think that's one of the reasons that's worked out. Now, kind of going forward and saying, well, I invest in VR companies and generally VR adjacent stuff. Like, sure, I can sit there and say, I know a lot about it. I can have good conversations with the founders. I can win deals because I'm like one of the few operators in that space that actually invests in any sort of institutional level. But I think the real reason that it actually works, and this is something that I think about more and more, is I think as an investor, your job is to invest in like 1% founder talent. I think you should think of it this way, that my job is to repeatedly invest in like the top 1% talent of founders and have a repeatable process for that or angle for that I can do that. And then kind of allocate my resources in a way that it would return well in the Monte Carlo experiment, like whatever it is you're trying to do. So that part, obviously, with the fund, that Monte Carlo part is just like portfolio construction, right? Like that's, you plug in variables, like, okay, the simulation gives me a 5x or 3x, whatever, it's reasonably plausible, fine, right? On the other side, it's like, okay, how do you access 1% talent all the time? And so for me, I think I realized that I was just like, okay, my angle to just accessing those people is if I invest in VR. Like that's just where I'm going to meet really smart people. And so that's actually what it ends up being, is like, it becomes less about the field to some extent, but more about like what is just the process that I create for me to funnel in the top people and have access to them, right? And so I think now that happens to be VR, right? And I think that's always something that subconsciously a lot of investors are doing, but I think particularly over the last year, it's become more obvious to me that's actually what the end game is. And so there's things I think to be honest about, right? And it's why you see a lot of good fund ones that start small at pre-seed, they crush it, they go 5 times bigger, they go to seed, they can't win anymore because it's not a formula that they have as a fund to access top 1% talent, etc. So like, I think that's really what everything ends up just kind of boiling down to. I know I kind of like completely went off on a tangent there, but you know.
We love tangents. We love rabbit holes. Maybe a quick follow on is like you said, you did a whole bunch of investing before sort of converging on the area that you've converged on.
Yeah.
What were your check sizes? Did they remain at the 10K level? And how many before you like, okay, this is a space I'm going to focus on?
One of the regrets that I definitely have, and I think for anybody watching this that is starting, is like really thinking of your own personal angel investing as a fund portfolio and like think of it in the same terms. Like obviously like you're not literally dealing with the same thing, but like I think the same principles apply in terms of like how you're building a portfolio, which means like if you're going to invest, commit to the idea of, you know, you want to invest in at least, like, let's say you're investing pre-seed, probably at least 25, 30, if not more companies than that, right? Like, otherwise the probabilistic chances that you return money is small. You probably want to be consistent with your check size. Like, to be honest, I didn't do that, right? So I put 10K maybe in the first couple of deals that I did that I wanted to do more, but I was like, well, I can't put like 10K into like 20 companies at once, right? So let me write like 5K check into this one, like probably not the best idea. So it kind of was all over the place for me personally, but that's also like, I came at this from like, I'm like building the plane as I'm flying it. Like I never even thought about, let me Google stuff or like even looking at stuff like this and podcasts like this, where you learn a little bit about how to get started or like what Hustle Fund is doing, right? With like the angels, I didn't do any of that. I was just like, I'm just going to make it up as I go, right? So it wasn't really until I joined this like on deck angels program that I actually kind of started thinking about things in more, even a personal, like institutional terms, and like really being a bit more professional about it. But like definitely advice I give to anybody is like, think of it that way. Like what can you realistically commit to for it to make financial sense for you, and then work backwards, right? Because you can invest 10K checks, if you can invest 25K checks, you can invest 2K checks, right? It's just like, I think you just want to be consistent with what your strategy is. Which again, I didn't do. And I think that's something that I regret that to some extent is biting me in the ass a little bit now. But you live it, you learn that way, I guess.
For sure.
Yeah, this is a step back. And it's a good question to ask because here you are, Oculus engineer, now GPing. The question is kind of simple, but I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. Why this and not Oculus 2.0 or something along those lines?
So you're saying like basically like why like do VC versus like, hey, I have like a background, want to like build a company or something like that?
Yeah, like the purpose behind all of this.
Well, I think it's funny because I would say that this has been like in my, like when talking to LPs and fundraising, it's been like a very big question that I've gotten, right? Because my trade, obviously I work within like Meta Reality Labs and worked on like the AR VR stuff, like kind of product wise, but like my trade is like I'm an AI engineer actually, right? So I built models there, like AI infra and all this stuff. And so of course, when I started raising the fund was right when really this like AI hype bubble started, right? And so really a lot of people asked me, were like, you could easily start a company, raise like $5 million, right? Like versus like raising a fund right now, which is like way harder than raising that for a company right now. It's like, and you have a great background, so why wouldn't you just do that? And I said, because I tried doing a company once and I hated it, right? It's like I explicitly don't want to do it. Granted, I'm starting a different kind of company now, right? But I like the operations of this better, and it's just what I want to do, right? And so that's kind of like the very like shallow answer to it is just like, I just enjoy my time more doing this than I did when I tried being a founder. I think the other thing is like, why did I end up at Oculus and do AI and all this stuff in the first place, right? I think like that's sort of where it starts. And so I actually learned, started dabbling in, well, back then they called it machine learning. Now they call it AI. It's tomato, right? When I was building the startup that I mentioned, and I had to build like a ranking algorithm and stuff for it. And you start playing with models. And anyway, I was like, I had this moment where I was like, I think that this technology will be pretty transformative. You know, this was like 2014 or something, right? So it was still like fairly primitive to what you have now. But I can see where this is going and I want to learn it because, like, frankly, I'm actually scared shitless of what this could become. And to some extent, like, you're starting to see that rear its head a little bit now. With VR, I had like a similar thing. So I actually went and I got hired by Facebook to work on integrity systems, right? So because my background is actually natural language, and that's what I got hired for. But I tried the Oculus headset like the first week I was in the office there. And I was like, actually, I want to work on this. Like I had a similar feel like aha moment where I'm like, I think this is going to change the way we compute. Again, it's so very rough. It's so very primitive when you can start to see where like this is going, right? And I want to be part of that. And there were some practical considerations to that as well in terms of like hedging and taking some asymmetric bet within a corporate career. But that was like what I was very motivated by. And so the kind of theme with this was always like, I'm pretty convinced that we're on this precipice of like transformative technology and I want to play a role in that. So that part was always very clear. I know I don't want to be a founder, but on the flip side, I'm also like, for me personally, I don't want to sound like sanctifying myself in any sort of way, right? Because it's really not the point. You know, like particularly when you invest pre-seed and really early, like there's to some extent, like you are a bit of a signal for saying like a company should exist and this is a good thing and we should back this and not. So you're almost like a bit of a judge to some extent, a bit of a gatekeeper. And like, particularly because I think like with the stuff that I'm investing in, actually, there's a lot of downside risk if done poorly. To me, it actually feels a bit missionary to be responsible with like driving kind of that technological progress forward. Because to some extent, like I'm not obviously not the only one. I'm not, and I shouldn't be. But like I have some say in and some vote in like what technology should exist. Like what should we have, right? Like again, I don't want to say like I'm the bastion of virtue or anything like that. But you know, I'm trying to be responsible, and that to me is very exciting, right? And like to some extent, like sure, you can do that as a founder, but it's like breadth versus depth, right? And for me, like breadth has always kind of been more interesting than depth in that sense. And so that's why, at least for the time, I feel like very comfortable and like this is what I really want to do and spend my time on. To me, it's very fulfilling beyond just the, oh, you make money and hope to return your fund 5x and whatever, right? But really, like I really at a very deep level actually enjoy the outcomes of what I'm doing. And
I mean, hopefully it all aligns, right? And the stars align and purposeful approaches to how you spend your time and responsibility all align and create outcomes.
It feels like a magnus opus to me in many ways. It's what I always kind of describe it as. It's like, okay, like everything I've kind of done in my professional career is affected like even small things, right? Like I think manifest in like being a GP. I mentioned a lot of stuff, there are even like smaller trends in my life that I've learned about myself that I just like to do, right? Like I've always enjoyed like mentorship stuff, right? You know, I was always like a TA. I was a TA in college. I like tutored kids in high school. So I always really enjoyed that kind of thing. And, you know, where you're kind of like mentoring, supporting people, figuring out what they want to do. Like I coached like when I was in college, I coached my high school basketball team, like the assistant coach and stuff. I always liked doing stuff like that. Like I did it not because I was like, I need money or something, but because I just like doing that sort of thing. And like, I sort of think that the investor founder relationship is like very similar in that sense, where like you're kind of just like a support system to some extent, a lot of time to founders. And then, so I like that, right? Like funnest job for me actually is just the portfolio stuff, like talking to my like founders I've invested in. And a lot of times you just need to give them space to vent and just say whatever they want to say, and being a founder is hard, right? So I like that stuff. For me, it's not work. Like people always ask me like, well, so how much time do you allocate to portfolio? I'm like, I don't know. I just text with founders all the time. Like, it's not really, I don't even consider it work. Like I'd be sitting at home eating dinner and I'm just like texting founders, right? Oh, they're like friends to me, right? So that's like another just like small detail of the job that like, it's a big part of it, but an important part of it. But for me, it's just natural and I like to do it.
And hopefully, where you spend your time is lucrative as well. So like, if I had to ask you a related question, what's your best investment so far? Like returns wise, the hard question.
Yeah, no, I know. So I was going to say that because I saw that in the notes that I was really like, a lot of the things I'm like, yeah, I kind of know what to say here. Like this is one where I was like, I have no idea.
And I realize I asked you a tough one because you're a pre-seed.
Yeah, I mean, so like, because there are two ways to put it, right? It's like, I'm still too early in this to actually have like a 250x exit where I can say that was a great investment. I'm not there yet, right? I think, but so the way that I think I break it down is that I think as time goes on, I start to develop a bucket of like, where I think the floor is just increasingly higher of where that company is going to go. Like, of course, you can always have like SWOT events to kill a company, right? So like kind of that aside, but in terms of like, this is an increasingly healthy company where like, what the exit you can start to project reasonably out of that is just the floor of that is like higher and higher. Like, I don't know yet, but I'm like supremely confident that I will be very happy once they exit at some point. One, ironically, is that CPG company that I mentioned. Like, I'm convinced that company's going to be a millionaire, like for sure. So, which is kind of funny because it's not what I invest in at all right now, but like, I'm probably going to do really well off that deal. At least such is my assumption. There's another one, Shapes XR, where I joke with the founder always that like, it's like a basic 3D Figma. I always joke with the founder is like, you're paying for my lake house in Lugano, right? But I think that one also just like in a combination of like, I think that company is just doing really well. It's going to do really well. Like my personal like skin in the game on it is quite big, where I'm like, that one will probably do me quite well. So they're like, I would say they're like a couple in that bucket where I'm like, I've seen it enough now where I feel supremely confident. Then there are ones where I'm like, I think they could be slow burners, but they're really well for me. But again, it's a little bit more 50-50. Then there's some where I'm like, I have no clue. Like they're moving, but I have no clue where this is going. And then the ones where I'm like, I don't think these are going to make me any money, basically. Sure. Like, so that's kind of like as much as like categorize it.
I love that. When you think about the ones that you are most excited about, what is it about maybe one or two of them? I don't want to ask you to make generalizations, but you could if you see a common trend in them, or just what are the things that stand out about any of them in particular? And if you're comfortable naming them, please go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely have a group of founders that I've invested in where like, I do know what the common trend is, right? I think the ones that I'm all the most confident about go back to what I said before. They're all completely different people. They have different backgrounds, right? There's really like profile wise, there's not really anything in common with these people. Actually, ironically, most of them are not like hyper credentialed either, right? Where you think like the cliche, like X Stanford, X this big name, whatever, high growth company, right? All these kind of like stereotypical archetypes that you think of like high potential founders. But the one thing they all have in common is that they're like, I invest in extraordinary founders doing important things. It's really just what I try to condense it down to. So important things are like, they're thematically doing something I care about, right? Or that I think is important, which is usually somehow defining like whatever your thesis is. The extraordinary people part, I've kind of condensed down to like 4 things. I'll gloss over that for now. But like, basically I just walk away from having talked to this founder a couple of times, even like, I don't know if the way they're doing it is right. Like, I like what the space that they're working. I don't know if the approach is necessarily the right one. Like, I don't know if I have a lot of questions about the implementation, but that founder is going to run through a brick wall to get it to work. Like, that's the only thing I know. Like, freaking capable people, right? Like, driven, capable people. And again, I have like a rubric of how to try to gauge this nowadays. But That's really what it comes down to. Like, there are definitely investments that I made. Like, one founder I'm a big fan of, like, he's Emmanuel at Scenario, which is like an AI gaming assets company. I was one of the early investors there, and I had like a thing with him where like his premise was, hey, media is going to 3D. It's kind of my thesis, right? For people to do that, it needs to be democratized. So like we need to think of some democratized like 3D asset creation for consumers. I'm like, I kind of agree with that too. And so they kind of went down like a photo scanning route and stuff, and like you can play with these assets. And so I was like, I don't know if that's the right approach, but this guy's freaking great. So I just want to like, I care about the problem and he's great. Let me give him money. Anyway, fast forward, long story short, the company almost dies. I mean, it's like runs out of money and the scanning thing is not working. And this is why I say invest in good people. Like I've seen some of the situations before. I've had it in some other companies where they get to this point and the founders just roll over, right? They give up, right? They call it a day. This guy was like, fuck it. Like this was like October, I think 2 years ago, like 2022. And he's sitting there and goes like, I want to make money by Thanksgiving. Like, that's the thing. I don't know how I'm going to do it. So he kind of like disappears and he comes back with this, like, we're changing it. Like AI is this stuff all came now. This is a better way to solve this problem. Right, we're going to do it. Anyway, long story short, fast forward, like they raised like a 50 million post last year. They raised like 10 million bucks in the Series A. They're doing really well for all intents and purposes. Right. And so that's 1000% on that founder. Right, like 99% of founders were probably given up in the position that he was in. Right, this big team, high burn, I have no money, nobody wants to fund me, I don't know what to do. Right, they would just said, let's just shut it down. He's like, no, I'm going to figure it out. And he did. And again, it goes back to like, I invested in him because I thought he'd be a legend, basically, and like, kind of, he's proving that, right? And so like, you see data points like that, and it's just like that's the commonality I see with a lot of the founders that I really like. Where I just think that somehow, somewhere, they're going to drive an outcome. Is there just kind of this like force of nature, like I call them extraordinary founders. Again, there's actually 4 points I have for that, right?
Yeah, please share. Like, what are those 4 things?
So this is, I actually wrote about this on Substack. I could like actually link that to you because like, if someone wants to go look at it. But the 4 things are, I look for like speed of iteration. So are they like really fast at kind of going from A to B, whatever they're doing, right? Which is typically why I actually also like to track founders a lot. Like a lot of times I'll meet a founder and I'm not 100% sure. And then I track what they're doing over 2 months, which is why I think like founders, if you're watching this, like always ask investors that don't tell you or no, like if you put them on updates, because it could be a very good way to get people back in. Maybe watch them for 2 months or so and it'd be like, holy crap, they did a lot in 2 months. So I'm like, that's good. The second thing is resourcefulness, right? So they actually do a lot. Like, so that speed of iteration is basically then measured by like how much money, like just human capital are they throwing at it. And so teams that are typically pretty scrappy, so they can do a lot with little, pretty good bull flag that not only are they just very capable, but when the going gets tough, they're going to figure out how to keep moving the company forward, right? Which I think is an important thing because inevitably every company is going to go through this trough of despair, right? And so you want teams that really have like a good inference that they know how to deal with that. The third thing, and this is one that I start to value a lot depending on what like verticals I'm looking at, but they have some sort of like unique insight or like quote unquote secret or access point about the industry that they're working in. So that could be they're like super veterans in that space and they just have like distribution points that nobody else has, right? Or like they're so deep in some technology that they just understand some truth about a sector that nobody else does, right? Like, so you try to gauge like, is there some like unique kind of non-consensus point that they have about this problem space? Then the fourth point, it kind of dovetails a little bit to that last point, but they have some sort of proven commitment to that particular problem space that they're working in, right? So that would validate itself a lot of ways. Again, they spend a lot of time in it. They have some sort of like success story in it, right? They just have some sort of thing that makes you believe that like this is where they want to solve a problem. Again, because I think this is important because for me, again, I'm looking at founder to problem fit a lot. Like I don't care about the means so much, but like take me, for example. Like I'm probably good at investing in VR, but I'm probably pretty bad if I'm an LP, right, and investing in AI-driven B2B SaaS or something. I don't know. Like, it's not going to be my thing, right? So The same is true. I think same is often true for founders. For me, I know there's some people that will disagree with me on that, and they've done well. So it's no wrong or right answer, but that's just my personal pace. So you want to be sure that they're not going to jump around, because I've definitely anecdotally had stories of a lot of founders that they would be like, call them like tourist founders, right? They're crypto when it's hot, and they pivot to AI when it's hot, and then they pivot to, I guess defense tech is now the new hot thing, right? They're going to be defense tech founders. Not a big fan of that personally. I like people, again, know something really well and are just like well positioned to succeed in that. And so that's kind of a big part for me as well, like the commitment piece.
I love the 4 things that you look for. And I think the unique insight has to come from having spent time in whatever industry they're showing up in. So the tourists will be kind of squeezed out.
You know what? Actually, one thing I've even found that insight can come a lot from is just from the first 2 points of being very quick and just being very resourceful. Because you start a company, maybe you don't know that much, right? But you just do so much in so little time that you just learn something, particularly in the frontier industry, that nobody else knows. You're just ahead of other people. Like I've made investments in that before, where I'm like, wow, they've really tried a lot of things and just learned things that nobody else knows. Right? So there are different ways to do it. It's not just you're in an industry for 20 years, it's a high level. Like I think there are a lot of ways to get there, but really from quick iteration to a lot of time. But you typically actually find that then like a lot of people that spend too much time in the industry, they're really bad on like the speed of iteration, resourcefulness, right? And so this,
oh my gosh, yes.
It's especially like big tech people, right? Like, and I say that as somebody coming from big tech, like if I see like Meta on a logo, people are always like, oh, you want to back like next minute. I'm like, no, they don't know what resourcefulness, the speed of iteration is. So
yeah, not anymore. Not anymore. I mean, maybe in the first few generations of Meta, but I agree.
Exactly.
Let's change the energy to lessons learned from the worst investment.
Oh, yes.
If you can go back to reality that, look, investor life is not always awesome, and we do have challenging moments. I would love to learn what that was and what you learned from it.
So there's I don't know if you know that meme template, but I've sent this to somebody before. Somebody on Twitter did it. But that meme template of like the bell curve where you have like the idiot looking guy that has just a really simple thing, and then you have the distressed guy that has this like very complicated explanation of something, and then the hooded like guru, right, that says the same thing as like the stupid. That's definitely me with a lot of this, just like I like the founder thing, right? Because like the first investment that I made was I like the founder, and then I did a lot of stuff in the meantime, and now I'm back to like I like the founder, basically. So a lot of those bad investments came in that middle point where I thought it was being really smart and sophisticated. All of the worst investments I made have one common trend, right? As much as the good investments have the common trend of like these high scoring founders on like my axes, basically, or like these like force of nature founders, and kind of screw the other stuff, like don't worry about the memes, are the ones where I fell in love with the memes too much. Where I would justify the investment because, again, I know some technology really well, or like I have some background, right? I'm like, oh, this is a really cool technology that they built, right? And I could totally build a thesis on how this is going to be relevant. But my entire investment gets basically driven by, I love the means of what they're doing, but like I don't care about the founders or the ends that much. Because it's very easy to write some like super fancy kind of thing about like why are we making this investment, right? Because it's like super smart, they built the smart technology, but like you're kind of about the founders, and it's less about the problem space, but the whole company's predicated on the means working. All the shittiest investments I've ever made were kind of like ones that fell into that category, all of them. You learn things that way, right? You learn things that kind of to the earlier point where I talk about founder and problem space. The means of how they get there, particularly if you invest pre-seed, will inevitably change. So if you invest in founders that are staking their entire company on means of how they're getting there, in all likelihood, I'm going to have a problem. And so like, I haven't had a lot of companies die on me yet. I think just like 1 or 2 really, but those, and then the ones that I'm kind of put in that bucket I mentioned before, but like, I don't know if these guys are going to be around in 2 years. I think really fall into that category a lot of the times is inflexibility, because they love the means and everything is about retrofitting the means, but not about how to address the problem. Which again is like the polar opposite of like Emmanuel that I mentioned, who said, maybe they're just better means to solve the problem that we're trying to solve, right? And let's just go with that. So yeah, like I think number one advice I could give to like particular operator angels is like, don't fall in love with your expertise too much as like a means of justifying doing an investment, right? Beyond just like the thesis of problem space and all of that, right? Maybe aptitude or trying to gauge aptitude of founders, but like, don't think that because you understand the means of what somebody's doing and it sounds smart that it's a good investment.
That's so good. I love that.
I never nightmares still thinking of some of the investments and where I'm like, I can't believe I did that. So bad, like really. But it's how you learn. I mean, I think like investing is all about putting in the reps and like making some of these experiences yourself. Like inevitably part of becoming a good investor means losing a lot of money to start. Like that's just kind of part of the game. I think like also like if you're thinking about getting into the angel investing space, like assume you will lose money and this is why you need a portfolio. Because the whole point is that the portfolio makes you money. Like an individual investment probably will not. You know, that's just something you have to accept. And like you're going to have some duds in it. It's part of the game. You're always going to have the good pieces as to why you did something at some point in time. Right? That's it. But a lot of it will work. And memes are always the worst things. Like meme, like investing in memes is always like a guaranteed way you're going to lose money. So don't do it.
Tell us now about how you're investing today. You have this fund. Maybe tell us the size of the fund, check sizes, and you're alluding to this, right? Having a repeatable way to access the 1% of talent. How are you sourcing your deals? I think you already talked a bit about how you decide. It's basically founders. So maybe tell us like the one-line pitch for Earthling, fund size, check size, and how are you finding these awesome founders?
Yeah, I think that last question is the fun one. So just like kind of on the logistics. So, I mean, I'm still raising fund one. We're deploying out of it already, but it's kind of in the middle, kind of writing 25K checks upwards to probably by final close. I want to be like kind of 100 to 200K check size. Again, very pre-seed. We only do first institutional round. And they have kind of like I mentioned earlier, like VR, AI, robotics companies and the only ones that obviously intersect there. So it's always pretty fun for us. Kind of more consumer focused, but we'll do picks and shovels, kind of just basically everything that pushes these mediums forward is kind of what we invest in. In terms of sourcing, I want to take a bit of like a detour on that question and bring it back because I think it provides like relevant context also around the fund. Like, you know, we're definitely in a fund consolidation era right now. And a lot of people ask me like, oh, like what made you decide to start fund and all of that? And you need to be really clear that you have like some sort of need to exist, right? Like I always say that like your fund, your default assumption should be that your fund has no reason to exist until proven otherwise, basically, like especially with the environment that we're in right now. And I think one of the considerations that I had was I have kind of a bit of a unique position as like super early, like comes from this operator background, explicitly invests in those things, which virtually like almost nobody's doing, right? So, you know, one tweet that, for example, that I did like at the end of last year, which got a lot of attention was when everybody was still talking about AI specifically. And I said, listen, AI definitely impactful, but overinvested, right? Doesn't make sense for us. So high impact, overinvested. VR and robotics, meanwhile, like the other parts of the thesis, high impact, underinvested. So that's where I want to spend time, right? Because I think that's where alpha is. And so I think like, but specifically like on the point of like, where my role always was a lot of people that are in this space, like acknowledge, for example, the intersection between AI and VR and how these things are pretty symbiotic, right? And like who's building there and all of that. And like not many people were doing that. Like, to be honest, nobody wants to just touch anything that's remotely related to VR, right? So it's like huge alpha thing for anybody that's investing because like 5 people that want to invest in this stuff right now, me included. So it's very small. And so I was doing that as an angel kind of very early. And so I was kind of the way I think I built my reputation in the VC world was this is a guy that can both understand markets because he's invested enough, but also like he's deeply technical, like really the front lines of like a technological trend that's just kind of like constantly evolving. And that was really attractive, particularly to a lot of VCs because like the VCs that want to invest in this had nobody to talk to. They could talk to them in market language and like kind of look at deals in a sophisticated way from the VC perspective, but it's also deeply technical. And so this was just, there are a lot of people in the world, of course, that do this for different things. I just happen to be one of the only people in this space that's doing it, right? Because it's very small, it's very niche. And so I think like, to take a tangential point there, I think like being niche and being known for niche is actually what has enabled me to do everything that I'm doing right now. And so like for anybody that's starting about investing or thinking about doing a fund at some point is like, when you're starting out, you need to be a big fish in a small pond. I think like if you're going to try to be a small fish in a huge pond, it's going to be really freaking tough. And you're going to be like really subject to this VC consolidation problem, right? Because you're pretty undifferentiated. It's going to be harder. So you're better off like being small being known for something really niche, or for all intents and purposes, you have less competition. And then just think about like how do you grow concentrically, right? That's probably the best way to get started. So that kind of like retrospectively is what ended up working for me. Like I didn't do that on purpose. It just kind of happened to be what it is. And if I'm trying to make sense of it, like I think that's really what happened. So basically I was in this position, and because of that, like I'm just the guy, like I am the VR guy. So I started doing a lot of deals as an angel, all of that. And again, not many people could talk the language of these founders. And I like to think I'm generally helpful and personable to founders. I'll let them reference that, but I think that's generally been feedback I've gotten, where it created this flywheel of like, oh, if you're starting a company, you should just talk to this guy, right? Because he's super early, right? Obviously, for a long time, he was an angel. He gets it. He was at Meta at the time, which is like the apex kind of corporate, obviously, in the VR space. And that just kind of created a flywheel, right? And so it just like, it brought an interest from VCs, it brought an interest from operators, it brought an interest from founders, obviously, where kind of to your question about like where the deals are coming from. It's like, that's just the reputation I have. People see VR and they think me. It just comes from everywhere in the network, right? From investors, from founders I've invested in, even from founders I haven't invested in, because there's so few people and like, this is the guy, right? And so on the flip side, that's also like the opportunity, like I see with the fun, right? Is that there's this like blue ocean, right? In terms of what you can build into, right? That was one of actually the considerations that I had, right? Was I could totally institutionalize this reputation that I have.
I love that. We were talking about this with Eric Ries too. It's like you need to stand for something that people will remember so that they think of you you've achieved that. They think of you when they think of AR, VR, robotics.
Exactly. That's like the point that I mentioned, that it's like, I think when you're starting out and you want to be like, again, they're obviously like angels that are just want to do this as a bit of a portfolio thing. And it's not really like a kind of professional / serious thing for them. And that's obviously fine, but that's a different strategy than like, hey, I want to actually like build an investing career. You know, it's definitely good. Like, and I did it too, right? I think when you start out, just look at as many deals as you can across all many different industries and don't think too much about it. But at some point, like you do want to think about, what am I going to be known for? And like, where's my specific opportunity, right? Like a lot of what I'm doing right now is even just driven by complete practicality. Like, okay, like I know I'm going to be good at VR. Is it all I maybe want to do with my time? No, right? But I know it's good for business, right? So it's something I'm spending like leaning into extra heavily primarily because of that. Not to say I don't believe in anything, I do, right? But like, if I didn't have to think about like how do I build my brand as an investor, my reputation as an investor with the position that I am, would I be spending as much time as I am right now? Probably not. I'd still be spending time, but probably not as much, right? It's just practicality. And that's what I'm known for. And it makes sense to just really solidify that. And I think for any investor that's thinking about going professional, like what is your shtick going to be basically, right? Like what is everybody going to know you for? Like one word. They see something and they think you, and try to work from there. That's when good things will start happening to you in the industry. Like you don't want to be another dime a dozen seed AI investor. Like how many of them are there, and like, are you really going to outcompete these people? No. Right? There might be something really weird and niche. Like there's one fund I heard about recently. Like I think they invest in like psychedelics or something, like psychedelic tech, something like this. I'm definitely butchering it, but like it's something along those lines where like, I'm sure there are like 5 people that are doing that, right? So like, I'm sure whoever's doing that, like there has a monopoly on psychedelic tech. And so if they're right about their sector, they're probably going to do great, right? And that's wonderful.
Yeah, I think what you're pointing to is that what we're noticing is like the VC industry is maturing. Not only is there more money in it, but we're kind of going from the cottage industry where everyone has to kind of be a generalist because someone needs to do the investments to, hey, there's a lot of money and a lot of smart people. And the best thing we're going to do is have people specialize, right? At least to your point at the outset, before you get into being able to do multiple different types of industries. And so I think it just speaks also not just to you and your opportunity, but like where the industry's at, right?
I mean, Chris Dixon has a really good piece on this, and he did the 20 VC podcast recently. And I think he has like a 2-3 minute segment where he talks about this. And I think it's like the best summary that I've heard on this. So I'm going to kind of paraphrase it, which is if you're a VC, you basically need to be like, to use his words, like a truffle hunter or like a heat seeker, right? Where truffle hunter is like you're a super specialist in some industry, you're like a pre-seed small fund, right? Call it sub 50, sub 100 million maybe. And you're just like really the first line on those things, right? That's where you're investing. Like that's where your alpha comes from. Or heat seeking is basically like your Andreessens and the Sequoias, right? Where you're a multi-billion-dollar firm that can buy huge ownership stakes and anything that's working really at any point in time, right, and drive returns. So you're really just going and winning all these deals that are like super hot, basically, right? Like those are like the two models that you need to like win in. And so the problem I think with VC is that like most funds probably fall into neither category. Like they're kind of like like because it's a barbell, right? Like they're kind of really in the middle. And I get how it happens, right? I mean, I know a few funds where they started as a small truffle hunting pre-seed fund. They did really well, unsurprisingly, right? Because that's why they did fund one in the first place. And so this is actually why I get why more LPs are becoming interested in investing in these small funds, because it kind of historically adds up. Anyway, they do well. And they're like, okay, instead of 25 million or 50 million, we can raise 200 million, which is great because, hey, we get all these fees, right? We can build our firm, right? But then their model all of a sudden changes from, hey, we're like a pre-seed specialist funds, right? We're the best reputation, like the only one kind of playing there, to crap, we now have to do seed and Series A investments and compete with Andreessen for those deals, right? And like, good luck, basically, right? Like that's probably not going to go in your favor. And so I think that's like when you see like a lot of the funds that's like maybe started really well, and that's when they got to fund 2 and fund 3, but then they start to fall off because like what actually made them successful change. And kind of going back to what I said before about that 1% founder access, you change your strategy in a way that you lose that. That's the thing to be like really weary of, I think, as you go through investing generally, is like, am I making decisions that negatively influence my ability to access that founder talent with my strategy? Be it as a VC or even as an angel, right? Like, because even if I was angel investing now, like, am I going to realistically access the best founder right now? And it's like building, like, I don't know, a cosmetic company or something? No, right? Like, I'm sure somebody in the world is, I'm not that person, right? So like, why invest in it, right? Like, it would be a weird strategy choice on my side, right? So yeah, I think that's just really what it boils down to, right? It's just like, what is your strategy and just leading into it. And you don't want to be caught in that middle of heat seeking and truffle hunting. Like you want to be pretty honest about what you are. I definitely recommend watching that, like Chris Dixon talked about it, because he's a lot more eloquent than I am, but it was a good piece.
All right. You ready for a speed round of questions?
Let's do it.
Okay. Let's see. Who's another first funder you admire?
Adam Draper. So Adam was on LP in my fund, but also like kind of a bit of a mentor kind of role for me. But so his fund Boost, I think, is effectively the blueprint for how I'm trying to build my fund. And like in terms of like the difficulties they had 10 years ago, what they're doing, I think is a lot of what I'm going through now. And so it's both like a role model for me, like in every way. Like I think they've absolutely crushed with Boost, right? So just surely from a returns perspective, I think it's probably one of the most underrated funds in the world. I'm obviously very biased, but I don't think they get the credit they deserve just sheerly for like DPI that they've produced. But also just the path that they walk to get there, right, is I think very analogous to like what I'm probably going to have to do over the next decade. And so it's very much a role model fund and GP for me in more ways than one. So, and Adam's great. I mean, like great guy. I mean, I think great investor, like really infectious personality and all of that. Like, so really just like, that's the kind of GP you want to probably be in 10 years. So definitely Adam.
Nice. Okay. The soundbite for how you get better at investing other than reps.
Ooh. Talk to smart people, I think, is a good thing. So I still do this, right? Like I've definitely sat here and for the last hour have presented myself as this great expert on VR. I still, a lot of times, don't rule out the fact that maybe I'm thinking about something in the wrong way, right? And like, even though I don't necessarily just follow somebody's advice, right? But I think a lot of times I've really benefited a lot from just hearing what other people have to say about something and how they're thinking about something. And I think it really like evolves your own process about like how you're talking to founders, how you're maybe evaluating something, maybe the important things that you're missing, maybe the things that you're actually overstating, right? If you're sort of looking at a deal. So I think one of the benefits generally investing is like, it's probably one of the highest IQ industries in the world, right? The founders are usually really smart. The investors are usually really smart, very accomplished people, because VC is a very kind of, I think it's an industry you graduate to for the most part. Like I've been very extraordinary at some point in the past. Leverage that. Like it's like the coolest thing ever. Like I always say my job is to talk to interesting people all the time. Like it's the coolest job ever, right? So definitely leverage that to think about your own framework about how you're like evaluating, right? Like for example, the 4 points that I mentioned before, like I didn't necessarily think of that entirely, but just sitting in my room and like what makes sense. I'm like, I learned a lot of that just from like observing other people that have good ideas and taking some of theirs, right, mixing with my stuff. And I think it's just going to make you a lot better by just talking to a lot of interesting people in the space.
Yeah, and then talking and thinking gets synthesized down into either books or some piece of media. So what's your favorite book or piece of media that's influenced how you invest?
I'm going to be super cliche, and probably when I say this, it might not be a surprise, but 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. I go back to it all the time, and I'm like, this is still the absolutely most correct, but like take some guts to implement book on investing, or like at least makes you think about investing, right? Because like what he said, everybody knows it, right? But I think to actually implement it is hard. To see like be non-consensus, right? Like competition is for losers, like all these sorts of things, like which is basically like the polar opposite of what a lot of investor behavior is right now, right? So it's hard to do, right? Particularly if you're dealing with like LPs and all that stuff. It's like it's a hard thing to do, but I still think it's the most right one. So yeah, I will always go back to 0 to 1. Like I just think it's the most genius business book ever written.
Okay, Zoom, phone, or in person for meetings?
Zoom, definitely.
Are you a default camera on guy or?
Yeah, like definitely camera on. I'm down for coffee meetings and stuff. Like after I've had the intro call, and I'm like, "There's a vibe," right? Like I'm totally happy to go meet people. Like I do it all the time, right? But you talk to so many people in this industry, and like inevitably, most of the people you talk to won't really lead to anything. And like that's fine. That's just like a function of the job. Where doing like initial coffee meetings is just too high of an investment for me, or like I feel like I lose bandwidth by doing that. And so like you're on the side of not really doing it for the first meetings at least.
Well, one thing we didn't talk about is something that might surprise some listeners is even though you're investing in the edge of AR, VR, and robotics, you're not based in San Francisco.
I'm not.
Let's detour on that for a second. And how does that work? Like, can you still get the deals that you're looking for? I know you have this flywheel all set up. Does it not matter where you are?
I think 80% of the time it doesn't matter. I even talk to people about this that live in the Bay Area that I work with. Because the default, like kind of what I mentioned before, is you're meeting founders for the most part, like by reference, right? I think it's a very reference-driven industry, right? And so that's the one thing. And the second, a lot of people acknowledge this reality of time efficiency, right? And that even like you're both in the Bay Area, like right now, probably more likely than not, you're going to Zoom, right? I think that's just true for a lot of investors. So at that point, it doesn't really matter where you are, but I would say like 10 to 20% of the time it does. And that you travel for. But I would say like generally like the companies I talk to, the companies I've invested in is very distributed. And a lot of people actually get surprised that like, out of the fund so far, we've done 8 investments. I think only 2 are based in the Bay Area. Like the rest are kind of like all over the place. And so to me, at least for like the things that I'm investing in, I don't think it's as bit of a center of gravity as some people might think. And again, kind of like you mentioned, I do have a personal flywheel there already, but because the industry is so small, like inevitably that still weighs very heavily. But I am, of course, pragmatic, and I do try to stay like kind of on top of like, do I need to be somewhere at a certain time? Is it useful? Like, do I need to relocate full time at some point? Like, definitely like a reality I'm open to, but like at this point, it just hasn't really felt necessary. The one counterpoint I will make here on SF, and so this is probably going to piss a lot of people off, but I'm going to go hard on it, is back on this kind of Peter Thiel thing, 0 to 1, and competition is for losers, and trying to be non-consensus and all of that. I think like SF is a good place for people that start their careers, right? And so I'd be a hypocrite. Like I lived there before. Like when I started my career, I was in the Bay Area, and that definitely had some benefit. But I think like it's true that it's like a good place for people to start building their networks as they start their careers out. I don't think it's great of a place for people that are more established, particularly if I'm looking from the company building perspective, because the one thing that I see in SF, like this is very, for example, prevalent in AI right now, is it's obviously a hot topic. All the young kids are talking about it. Everybody wants to build an AI company, but so subsequent, and there are all these meetups, right? So you can go to all these meetups, and everybody talks about the same thing all the time, right? And so you see the same kind of companies, you see the same insights, right? There's not a lot of kind of on this point that I mentioned earlier about like unique insight or something. There's not a lot of that really. There's not a lot of differentiation, and so for me, actually, a lot of SF companies became like not things I want to invest in. Like I actually like got very turned off by it. And ironically, like for example, AI, like actually some of the more interesting companies that I've seen are not based there. Like we just invested like in an AI company that's based in Zurich, right? Where I'm like, these guys are just hardcore researchers that just first principles, like just went out for something that makes a whole lot of sense, right? And it's a great team. Ironically, they actually got to recent speed run, right? So, they're doing pretty well. That's like kind of what my thing has become now, that like, I'm actually finding more interesting founders not in SF because they're not as exposed to like the same thought patterns as is like very, very prevalent across all these events and investor talk and people you run into, right? There's almost some downside of the density of talent in SF in that regard. And so like actually as time goes on, I'm becoming more and more interested in people that are not there, which I know sounds very like, how could you say such a thing? It's like sacrilegious, but like, I'm just kind of like observing behavior and just trying to like match accordingly. I get the upsides of SF. There's definitely like the talent density, but I don't think it's the best idea. Just a quick anecdote on that, just to try, I'm not completely crazy with this actually. And I'm not going to name names of this on the podcast, but a friend of mine from college who started an AI company who got backed by a very, very well-known VC. They were not based in SF, but so at some point the company decided to move to SF because they felt it was better to hire talent, which like fair enough. Like that is definitely one benefit that SF has over a lot of places, particularly if you insist on now in-person culture, right? But that investor, and again, very big guy, basically told him the compromise they found with him, because he was against it initially, was that company has to institute like some sort of policy that if you're an employee there, you cannot attend meetups and events in San Francisco. Largely being driven by the fear that not only is it going to be a waste of time and unproductive, right? Because you're spending all this like kind of time in socials, but you're basically going to fall into groupthink. And that's actually not good for the company to succeed, particularly like if you're building an AI company right now. So that was from some huge VC that has achieved a lot more in their life, like way more in their life than I have, like more than I could probably think of achieving. But just to show I'm not completely nuts. So there's an anecdote there that's not mine.
So in 10 years, you're on the Midas list. Like aside from reps, what you point back to and say, that's what got me there?
One of the things I think about a lot, and what I mentioned earlier, is that, well, like one of the reasons I invested in VR is because I know like I'm going to get top 1% founder talent there. Like that's what I have access to, right? So the general thing that I have looking forward is, well, on that trend, how do I continue to expand my thesis, if you want to call it that way, like my kind of market thesis or whatever, in a way that I can just continuously scale that 1% access in a more broad way, right? Because I think realistically, like the biggest returns we all know come from non-consensus outliers that you're right about. You're just really early into. And I think this is something a lot of investors generally forget, right? They get too obsessed with like hot trends or like co-investor signal, whatever, without actually realizing that like maybe you'll make a good investment there, sure, right? But for the most part, for most of us who are dealing with smaller checks, like that's where your home run's coming from. And that gives you like a 10,000x or something, right? Or like everybody tells you you're nuts for doing that deal, and you end up being right, and it ends up being a huge one, right? Like, so I think ultimately what will put me on the Midas list is that like I would have invested in some dude like that, probably, that like just completely crushes for the entire fund, or maybe like in like a small cohort of them. But that I think was where it comes from, right? And so it goes back to this trend of just like focusing on extraordinary founders, and the more shackles I think you can take off the parameters there, like probably the better. But it's this trade-off of like how much can you take the shackles off while accessing the best people in the world, right? And so I think what shackles are for is to streamline, like how can I access 1%, but hopefully over time, like you're more likely to increase your chances of having great success if the more those shackles come off, I think, over time.
Thank you for sharing that. Dan, do you want to wrap up the last speed round question?
I think I know the answer to this one, but social media platform of choice.
What do you think?
I mean, I'm going to go with X.
Yeah.
So
the VC, I don't know how many like investors you're going to have on this are not going to say Twitter. So
you would be surprised how many
Really?
didn't say that. And I think the difference is, my guess is your flywheel works a lot off of X. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's been good for networking for sure, particularly on the investor side, I would say, and like just meeting more investors. I've definitely also met some operators. It's not great, to be honest, for sourcing deals.
Test 1, 2. Hi, it's Shaharose here, tapping in from home. So after the interview, we rabbit holed on a question. And after that, I had another question. So I sent Arian a voice note and he shared a response. So the next two questions are rabbit hole questions that we ended up recording after the interview. And so you can listen to them here. Thank you. Let's quickly spend a few minutes on a question that I've had. So particularly in the space that you're in, right? There's physical product, there's hardware. Things take time. And even in software, things take time. And more recently, I shared a deal with an investor where it was sort of, it was like a hardware meets software play. And of course, it took time before reaching product market fit, like up to 3 years. And their reaction was, well, that's a long time in market, even though at this point, the beginnings of what looked like product market fit. So when you think of time in market, like what matters to you? Does it matter to you? You know, you often hear about success stories that took even longer than 3 years before even getting to product market fit, but the seed investment or the pre-seed was already done.
Right.
What matters to you in terms of time to market?
Yeah, I think like one of the there's definitely an investment who I've lost because I kind of ignored that, right? Not for the time of market, but like the timing aspect of like, do I believe in this macro thesis of what they're doing makes sense? At some point, somebody will make money doing this? Yes. Do I see the practicality of doing this now? Maybe less. Like I didn't really consider that, and so that's something you try to be mindful of, particularly if you're investing in very frontier things. Like, what is the strategy to actually existing in year 5, right? To really reap the tailwinds, right? So, I think there's a few ways the market is manifesting that right now, at least like in my industries. The old model of you raise every 2 years or whatever doesn't work anymore, right? And so I think what you're just seeing now is, at least in our spaces, like companies are just getting really damn efficient, right? Like they've figured out they can do things with small teams on low burn. They might only, and so they can kind of sustain themselves for a very, very long time. In many cases, actually, these companies become profitable. Like 2 of the 8 companies that I have are like completely profitable. Like they don't have to raise money again, right? They're just kind of like chugging forward because they're just very lean and they're very pragmatic with like, well, maybe we have a big vision, but like, what's the most practical way to approach this? How we like burn as little money as possible doing it because we have to, because there's nobody to save us, because there's nobody to give us money like there wasn't years ago. So I'm looking at it more that way.
We're talking a lot about these types of companies. What are they to you? And do you think they exist in your portfolio?
I definitely have at least one. I'm honestly trying to figure out what to call them too. Like one term that I've heard, but like this doesn't necessarily dictate the size that they will be, is like raise once companies, right?
Right.
They basically raise like one round and that's it. Which I think we're going to have a lot of in the portfolio. And something I've actually started to think about more is like, fund 2 at some point, right? Like I have one company in my portfolio right now. They raised the pre-seed like I think it was 1.1 million. We participated in that. They're a 4-person team, like they're like young dudes, right? They've made $2.5 million. They burn no money, right? Because they're 4 people. They probably never have to raise money again because they basically have like profits of like what a Series A fundraise would be. And they can just keep reinvesting it. I think these guys might be one of the biggest VR companies ever. If you fast forward 10 years, but like, so great, like 100% will be great for DPI, I think, but not going to be great for, if I'm just using like, round markups and stuff with like to sort of define my MOIC, like a lot of investors do. I'm thinking about like what that also means for reporting, right? And like generally how you talk about like the health of your portfolio, right? Because if I have like half my portfolios like this, let's say like we invested pre-revenue, they're doing 9-figure revenues, 8-figure revenues, right? It's kind of disingenuous for me to say that they're worth like the $5 million I spent on them, like that I paid for them like 4 years ago, right? But that's technically with how we price things a lot now. It's not how they'd be priced in the portfolio, right? Which doesn't really make any sense. So like, I think the macro point here is that like the dynamics of how we think of venture will change a lot, because I think like that reality of like the $1 billion company coming, like I don't think it's going to be science fiction. Like I think like proverbially we will get there where like very small lean teams literally produce $1 billion of value. I argue it's already happened. Like if I look at another Axiom, which is a VR company, I think you can make the argument they're a $1 billion company. How the hell do you price that when you're like looking at like the progression of venture portfolios? I don't know, right? And I think it's like an industry-wide question, actually.
Yeah. Multiple on revenues, go PE
Yeah.
style.
Oh, really? Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of like one person I think suggested like, a fair valuation, they put on like 498s or something that they get like employee stock options or something,
Totally.
right? Like,
Oh my
there are
God.
a ton
Yeah.
of ways to do it, right? It's just like we need to find some consensus on what that's going to be because I think this is going to be a more prevalent problem.
My quick follow-up question that I had was, you invest in two types of companies that I feel most traditional VCs stay away from, which is hardware and studios or content creation or content media companies on the VR side. Tell me how you think about underwriting those, and how do your LPs think about that? And how do you ensure that there's enough follow-on investment when there's so much hesitation to invest in those types of assets? The funny thing is as we even talk about hardware, robotics, VC is designed for that, right? Like it's designed for high capital intensive products and solutions that need that initial capital. And yet VCs run away from that. I never understood that. So would love your thoughts.
Oof, great question, first of all. So I think there are two ways to kind of go down the content side and the hardware side and the robotics side. But I think the high level response is that what's uniquely interesting about both of these categories of companies is that we're actually at a point now where they can all start generating money pretty quickly, to the extent that some might even become profitable and might not become dependent on future venture funding. So for example, on the content side, and particularly VR studios, and the one thing that I'll emphasize here is I think generally, like if you put VR as some subset of gaming or entertainment kind of more at large, which I think is probably a good categorization, content is traditionally the most lucrative business to get into. Now, VCs, of course, will often complain about the scalability and whatever, but like the reality is, like if you look at the gaming market at large, traditionally, if you look at like the very valuable companies, they're gaming studios, right? They're not infrastructure companies. Like, probably the biggest gaming infra company, so to speak, is like Unity, right, which is a $6 billion company, I think, last I checked. But, Activision, which is, they just make games, got bought for $70 billion, right? So just in a very historical way, like content is actually very valuable. So I think that's the one piece to that, and particularly on the VR side. And so like even in our portfolio right now, we have a 4 or 5 person team. They're expanding a little bit now, but they raised a little over $1 million, and they're probably going to exceed 20 million in revenue this year. So it's like a VR studio. They probably never need to raise again. And so a lot of the bets that we're making is that, we're moving towards a trend where companies can be built that only need to raise once and then kind of become profitable and just like self-sustain their growth. And they can sort of grow on the same trajectory because of that as if they were venture-backed. So that's kind of the content side. Then on the hardware side, I think the interesting thing about robotics, and I think one reason it's really interesting to invest in this specifically right now, is on one hand, off-the-shelf parts have gotten quite cheap to build robots. So I think usually when you think of hardware, traditionally it's you got to raise millions of dollars, it's expensive to build, it takes a lot of resource, it takes a long time. You might need to raise a few million over a couple of years to even get to prototype stage and so on and so on and so on, right? Which made it very risky because, particularly at the very beginning, because, particularly when you're investing like pre-seed into a robotics company, it takes a very, very long time to actually see if your investment makes any tangible sense. That's not really true anymore. And, I've invested in a couple of companies now where they've been able to go to market with prototypes and actually like deploy hardware into the real world with like 500 grand, right? So really you're at a point now where things have gotten so cheap that you can actually start to see market traction on these things much, much earlier than you could have like even 3-4 years ago. So that's the one thing. The other thing is everybody's benefiting from all the AI trends, right? And that's sort of coupled in with that just enabled new categories of market viable robots that didn't exist, particularly more in the consumer space, because you're kind of breaking down that communication barrier between what has typically been difficult and to control in terms of inputting into a piece of hardware, into a robot, versus now everybody can use natural language. And so that communication layer is actually quite important, not just for actually the hardware, but actually the software side of the hardware, because, I think that's always the thing to emphasize, that for hardware or for robots generally, there's of course the hardware component, which has gotten cheaper, and now the software component, that of course is the brain of the machine, right, that animates the machine. that has become a lot more advanced. And so there are a lot of opportunities there, but the same sort of trend holds that you're able to produce market viable businesses with just a lot less money and a lot quicker time. This is more true for like VR content than for robotics right now, I would say, but generally speaking, you can just generate market traction quicker. So the game's kind of changing there. And so more on the robotics side, I would definitely also say that there are a lot of new categories that are being created. So for example, like we have a company, Nunu, which they're basically building like a quality assurance agent for robotics. So, you build a robot and this thing is some sort of quality assurance mechanism that like red teams that robot in real space. So this is going to be really valuable if you assume that we're just building more and more and more robots and becomes a bigger part of the future, which most forecasts indicate. But they're right now, given the maturity of the market, are targeting gaming, right? And so they're using this for gaming agents and like quality assurance in gaming and that sort of thing. And that's actually really interesting, but I think a lot of people don't really know how to underwrite these things. It's like a completely new category. And so that's a little bit more dicey, I would say, to be honest. Like I've had conversations with the founders before that have gone very much in the direction of, we don't know what benchmarks for these kind of businesses look like to go from, say, pre-seed to seed because it's a totally new category. And I think a lot of people just don't know how to underwrite the opportunity, where the mentality has often become, well, we have 1.5 million. We can go super lean, right? We can stay a 3-4 person team, have really, really minimal burn, and just start to find some product market fit, and just go from there and sort of just grow the business really without being VC dependent. And so I think that's the general just mentality you're seeing from a lot of these founders, is that they're going in a direction that's more focused on, let's just get some initial capital in the door to get started and to start building, but then like get ourselves off the VC dependency train really, really quickly, because there's actually market opportunity and there's opportunity to make money. And so that's just also a mentality shift that I've seen. But again, it's kind of aided by some of these just fundamental steps up in off-the-shelf parts, better off-the-shelf technology for all intents and purposes that's enabling that. So I think that's the high-level view on it.
Things are changing right before our eyes, and you're entering at such an incredible time for all of us to watch. Very excited to see where you go with all this. Dan, is there any last words on your side?
No, equally excited. Can't wait to see what happens in the next 6 months, year with you and the fun. Yeah, hopefully we get to circle back and do this same chat again.
My gosh, thank you so much for this interview, Arian. Where can people find you online?
Twitter, as we just talked about, is probably the best. LinkedIn, if you insist. Also email. I try to be very responsive on email. So I don't know if you have show notes or so, but obviously you can drop that for Arian or Earthling VC. Yeah, that's probably the best way.
Love it. You're amazing. This was awesome. This particular episode is coming from the perspective of someone who is an emerging GP. So as we share these takeaways with that mindset, but I've noticed a lot of the thoughts that came up for me from this apply really across the board. Maybe I'll just start with like something that stuck with me that I'd love to hear your take on, that isn't new. And through various episodes, we've heard this really, which is like, to be a great investor, a VC, an emerging manager, or an angel, sort of being known for a space or thesis or a type of founder really goes a long way, right? It builds a flywheel, it builds your focus, it leads to you hopefully seeing the top 1% of talent and companies to invest in. And when we talked about that, it kind of like reminded me that, well, the tech industry has matured, VC has matured. It's no longer the Wild West where there's just a fewer number of opportunities and less money. It's like the opposite, right? There's so many opportunities. There's so much money. There's so many people trying to do VC, trying to be entrepreneurs. And I think in a crowded space now, specialization, building a flywheel, standing for something specific kind of is the only way to go. What do you think?
I think the best emerging managers default into their space by virtue of what they were previously doing. And what they were previously doing means perhaps a specific area of technical expertise or just a specific network. And then you sort of default into a built-in advantage that your fund has. Most people do that. Some emerging managers kind of just like randomly pick one and kind of go after it because they understand what you're saying, which is like, you need to to have some sort of shtick if you're going to be successful. So I guess that's one way of like filtering perhaps for LPs, right? Like it's one thing to have a shtick or a vertical. It's another thing to have come from that vertical and have worked in it before.
So the thing in that conversation, we talked about, or he reflected on a conversation that Chris Dixon had shared on the 20 VC podcast about truffle hunting and heat seeking. And I was curious your take on that. I am seeing a difference between the deal characteristics of deals that tend to end up with smaller emerging funds versus the big mega funds. And it feels like two parallel worlds where sometimes they'll collide, right? Like someone who maybe got invested in by a smaller fund eventually gets invested by a larger fund, and maybe not the other way around. Like truffle hunting versus heat seeking, I think feels like a clear distinction that has now happened. Do you see that? Is there a clear delineation?
I mean, maybe can we define truffle hunting and heat seeking for the audience?
Well, look, I didn't listen to the podcast, so I hope I didn't get it wrong. But what I took away was more specialized deals. Well, truffle hunting, I think I understood it as like not hot deals, but like diamonds in a rough.
Yeah.
Right? That like, I mean, truffles are so hard to find, so are diamonds.
So, I mean, the truffle analogy is useful because you have this like, you have to develop certain methods of finding truffles, whether it's a pig who happens to have a skill set for smelling them out or whatever. It's like a unique thing that enables you to find them. Heat seeking is like, it's blatantly obvious because it's, co-investor signal.
Or founder signal because they're like 2 or 3 time founder or something like that.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And I think the deal characteristics end up being in the heat-seeking category, higher valuations at an earlier stage versus not. That's my guess.
Yeah.
And so, is that the sort of like, are you seeing that delineation as well?
I mean, it's easy to say like, okay, the big funds, the well-known funds, they're heat seekers, or they actually are the ones that create the heat. And so they're never not in a heat-seeking situation. But I don't know that's true, because the biggest funds also operate these scout programs at scale that or it's at a scale that's kind of hard to fathom. They actually employ thousands of truffle smelling pigs, and they, in parallel to heat seeking and creating heat, they also truffle hunt at an incredible scale. So in that way, I think, the argument that an emerging manager has like a monopoly on truffle hunting is sort of like false, I think. But I think if you have an emerging manager with a really unique skill set, technical background, or network, then you have those unique characteristics are truffle sinking, if you will.
That's right. I think you're right. I think that's where the conversation goes, is that probably emerging managers, smaller funds play the truffle hunting game because it would be hard for us, I assume we're in that camp, to play in the heat-seeking game. I mean, you and I have certainly participated in hot deals for sure. So maybe it's not so cut and dry. Maybe it's just, it is what it is.
Those hot deals we got into, a large degree of effort and energy went into just getting into them, and we paid for it in terms of price. As an emerging manager, craft your strategy. I don't know. Like, can you repeatedly do that? Perhaps.
Yeah.
But there's a negative feedback loop on that, right? Like, if you have access to it, why do you have access to it?
Yeah. In hindsight, I wondered that too. And so when you're not at a mega fund and you're now 5 years in, you and I, investing in both truffle hunting ways and also heat seeking ways, what do you do today? Like, what do you look for? Do you stay away from the heat seeking or the heaters or the hot deals, the heaters?
I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't have a long enough track record deploying capital, like a very consistent manner to say I know exactly what works and what doesn't. But it feels like you're better off in a truffle seeking strategy. That
totally.
I actually don't even know you could. Okay, like let's say you do raise a fund and you're going to be a heat seeker. Can you do that? Like, can you actually go out and raise a certain amount of capital and know that you're going to be able to deploy it, get invited to these heat-seeking deals, get an allocation? maybe. No, I feel really good about the bets that I make that are like 3 million val caps on a safe that, you're just like, yeah, the founder started it yesterday.
And I think for me, I learned that over the years that you and I invested together. I had to do a couple of those deals, and I'm proud of getting into some of those heat-seeking deals. And I'm not the biggest check, and the valuations were high, and it's just going to look like a different profile than some of these very early companies.
I think a lot of emerging managers have found success in carving out how they truffle hunt. Like having a technical background in VR, investing in VR companies is excellent. And I think if you look across enough emerging manager funds and compare their returns to larger, more established funds, it could be quite surprising in a couple of years to see what the return profiles are.
Yeah, and historically they've done well. So let's see where this set of vintages go.
Yeah.
Another takeaway that came up for me, I am very torn on this one, so I really can't wait to chat about this with you. The discussion we had at the end around SF versus not. I feel like I'm old school here. I'm someone who has spent majority of her career in the Bay and have long held the view that to start a company in particular tech spaces, maybe not all spaces, maybe not CPG, maybe not fintech, and I don't even know what the right list is, that it's a city that aligns to the mindset of hypergrowth. It's a city that allows for you to go out in a social setting and talk about work and keeps you in your game constantly to create the momentum that you need, where even if you're out and about trying to have dinner, you might meet someone you might want to hire, or someone who can make an intro for you that like contributes to the speed and the momentum because of the density. And I often tell founders, like, that's the advantage. And if you choose to come here, if you're already here, make sure you get out for good periods of time, because this is a bubble and you can build your bias, right? And think you're doing everything right. And it's bias in terms of types of users that are here and even just how the world works, right? The world works a little different here. Like, what's your take? Does SF lead to superior investments and outcomes on average? What do you tell your founders?
I kind of look at it through the lens of what are the jobs to be done as a founder. There's hiring, attracting talent. I think you have a very clear advantage in doing so when you are somewhere where there is a lot of talent geographically. I think it's just kind of hard to really recruit through Zoom for, your first 10 hires. So later on, sure. And then after you've recruited talent, you have to build stuff. And so the what do we build part, definitely in person. In the big initial movements of actually laying down the first lines of code, sure, same room. I think there is a point though where the advantage is sort of a diminishing return. The work becomes process and customers need support. Now, you should still have a central place where you can convene maybe on a quarterly basis, reset strategy, plan for the next quarter. But at that point, I'm not totally convinced that there should be this fixation on being in SF or even New York or wherever. And so I think that part will be distributed eventually, and in 2030 will be man, it was kind of when everyone was like, oh yeah, you got to go get an MBA. Oh, you have to be at SF. True in some regards, yeah, but others not so much.
Yeah, I like your delineation. And when you say, hey, at a certain point it changes, my interpretation is the right time for that to shift to distributed or headquartered elsewhere is post-product market fit.
One of the things I picked up from, which I really believe in, from Avlok, our CEO at AngelList, is this concept of stacking S-curves. That's what we do at AngelList, and the best companies also do that. And stacking S-curves is you've innovated once and you've ridden that growth and it starts to taper. So you innovate again and you stack these S-curves in order to create a massive company. What that means from how close should you be to San Francisco perspective is probably that you boomerang back and forth or something like that, or wherever it is. If it's New York, great. But if you're going to stack S-curves, then you are going to repeatedly have these periods of planning and building. It's unlikely that you're going to ride one S-curve into the sunset.
That's interesting. Wow. I like that. That could be another sort of framework for operating that people really rally behind. Yeah. Thank you. I have a last question to ask you, but before I do that, anything you want to share?
From the conversation we had, one of the takeaways was we spent a lot of time talking about his marquee investment and how it originated from someone he essentially knew prior to becoming a professional investor. And I think there is a lot to that. The co-founder I knew at Trust and Will was a friend before he started Trust and Will. And I've repeatedly heard from investors that counterintuitively their best investments have been like either in like acquaintances or friends. And there's no data for that, but like it feels right to me. And it stuck out as like an example, like, despite his efforts to build a pipeline of deals in his particular vertical, his number one example was actually some investment that did not come from the structure around his deal flow.
Yeah, that has actually come up in a lot of our interviews over and over again. And I think it's a reminder to listeners that there are people in your network that you should make sure you're in touch with, because you never know where that's going to go. And sometimes it's actually the lowest lift, right? Is to find out what's happening inside your immediate network.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Yeah. Very cool. Good reflection. The last thing I wanted to chat with you about was that the conversation at the end that we had around these capital efficient companies that are getting started. And it's interesting because he's investing in some spaces like AR, VR studios, like media hardware, and they're realizing that they can have really lean teams generate $2-3 million after a first round. And I had this conversation on the podcast, even again with Tyler Willis and a few others. These are a different type of profile, right? Because now you can't really track MOIC if they don't raise, but you hopefully will get some DPI because they're great companies. What's your take on this? What would you call them? Should VCs be investing in them? I think the answer is yes. Like, sounds like a successful company, but it's breaking the mold. Thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely different. We fixate on capital raised, even so far as to set our main metrics on the assumption that they will continue to raise it. So markups, right? But I mean, like when a company distributes profits, that's the flex. Like we're not here to perpetually raise capital and lose it. And it is funny that concept breaks the venture model. And that's about all I have right now. I think it's a funny thing to all of a sudden be like taken aback by the fact that there's a company in your portfolio that's good. They don't need more. And I think we're going to see more of it. And this is easy for me to say, but AI creates the possibility that you will need fewer team members to produce outsized returns. And if that's true, I mean, the main use of capital is people. If you need fewer of them, the math changes significantly. So my hypothesis is this is like the start of many, many more funds that are impacted by this like conundrum. We're just like, how do I make my numbers work for my LPs? Well, one day it doesn't matter, right? Because they'll get acquired or IPO if they're that great. And then the numbers shake out. But we're talking about this weird period of time in between that investment and that eventual outcome where, yeah, it's all off. And I think that's a really high level take because there are probably really, really sound ways to arrive at a proper metric that fits back into the reporting requirements that the fund has for companies that just are profitable.
Yeah, because you can't report DPI until there's DPI, right? So It's like what we were kind of alluding to, like, do we mark them based on a revenue metric, right? Like a PE style valuation.
Yeah, there's extremely trusted and sound concepts that funds could use in this scenario. I'm less interested in that. I'm super interested in companies that actually like distribute profits along the way.
Yeah,
I think that's a really cool concept that we might see more of.
Yep. And maybe you guys at Angelus will figure out that new metric that we can track in our portfolios.
Yeah. Or maybe we'll automate those profit distributions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cheers to DPI, friends.
Yeah.
Totally.
This is great. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, looking forward to doing another podcast with you. Thanks for listening. We'd love your feedback and suggestions on topics and guests. You can find us on Twitter X @Shahroz and @Averani.
Subscribe to our newsletter to get behind-the-scenes access, learn more about the guests, and receive the key takeaways from each episode. You can find it at firstfunderspod.com/newsletter.
And don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends at firstfunderspod.com/subscribe.